Hi, everybody. Today's Friday, November 28th, 2025, and our dear friend, Ambassador Chas Freeman, is here with us. Welcome back.
Glad to be with you, Nima.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And Ambassador, let me start with what has happened. And it was somehow tragic to see the shooting at the National Guard. Two of them were killed in this shooting. The guy who did this was he's from Afghanistan, and he's 29 years old. And from what we've learned so far, that he was recruited by CIA when he was 14 years old in Afghanistan. And from 14 years old since 2020, because he came to the United States in 2021 when he
Correct.
was 25 years old.
Right.
You when he came to the United States, he was working for CIA before that for 11 years. You know, when you see something of this scale happening, because it somehow shows the policies, the foreign policy of the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, right now in Venezuela, with the case of Venezuela, and how devastating that could be in a long run. What is your understanding of what has happened and the way that the Trump administration is reacting to that?
Well, this unfortunately plays into the xenophobic approach of the Trump administration against immigrants, particularly immigrants who are not European. And so it's tragic. Many Afghans who have now been suspended for further immigration processing will suffer as a result of what this man did. He has a wife and 5 kids in the state of Washington on the other side of the country. Um, I don't know what he was thinking. I suspect there were very personal motives to this. It's clear, despite the position, the efforts by the administration to blame this on Joe Biden and his administration, or to say that somehow this killer wasn't adequately vetted, that he was vetted very thoroughly. You don't get to work for the CIA unless you are thoroughly vetted. So this is, of course, violence is not abnormal in the United States. We are a relatively violent society. This man must have witnessed terrible atrocities in Afghanistan because he was part of a group that was raiding into Taliban territory, and they were famous for violating people's human rights. But the problem is, generally speaking, in the United States, the constitutional democracy that we enjoyed for almost 250 years is now rapidly decaying into authoritarianism. And this administration has a program putting the National Guard on the streets as part of it to militarize the police function in the United States and to overturn the rule of law in favor of a police state. So the Trump administration's immediate reaction, in addition to using this as an excuse to halt further immigration, has been to deploy another 500 troops on the streets of the District of Columbia. I don't live in the District of Columbia anymore, but some of my family does. And what these troops are doing is mostly picking up litter, walking around, standing around. They're not doing anything serious. And of course, the excuse for this deployment of the National Guard, which has just been ruled illegal by a judge in the District of Columbia on the grounds that while the president has the authority to do things in D.C., he does not have the authority to overrule home rule. This is a law passed by Congress. So anyway, everything is very uncertain. But what is certain is that the United States is going through a period of constitutional chaos, a crisis, and Donald Trump has emerged as an authoritarian figure. And And here I'm giving a talk at Brown University on Tuesday about the extent to which the United States is making mistakes in its competition with China. In connection with that, I came across a passage from Hannah Arendt, the famous political philosopher who focused on why Nazi Germany happened. And she says this: authoritarians arise when economic, social, political, or religious change makes members of a formerly powerful group feel as though they have been left behind. In this case, that is European Americans in a country which is becoming multiracial. Um, their frustration makes them vulnerable to leaders who promise to make them dominant again. A strong man downplays the real conditions that have created their problems and tells them that the only reason they've been dispossessed is that enemies have cheated them of power. This is an explanation for what is happening. The so-called deplorables that Hillary Clinton branded as such have feeling dispossessed, and they are vulnerable, as Hannah Arendt predicted, to a strong man who focuses them on enemies. You will recall at Charlottesville during the first Trump administration, the right-wing demonstrators chanted, "Jews will not replace us." At the time, I thought this was absurd. I couldn't understand it. Why would they chant that? What does this have to do with Jews? But it was a chant against plutocratic privilege, wealth, influence, which they believed was being exercised at their expense. And many of them were Southern Americans. The American South has a tradition of authoritarianism during the long period of racial segregation. So this incident with the Afghan graduate of CIA operations in Afghanistan is very convenient for the Trump administration, given its agenda.
We're living, Ambassador, in an era that you cannot separate what's going on outside of the United States from what's going on inside. Because we know with the case of Israel and Palestine, the Zionist power in the United States trying to picture these Muslim groups in the United States as the enemy. They're not part of us. They're not part of our culture. Is Judeo-Christian culture is not. They're not belonging to our society. It somehow makes some sort of chaos from within, and it all comes from the outside, from what's going on in the Middle East, in the West Asia, for the case of this sort of manufactured hatred between Muslims and Christians, Jews, and all of this. What is your understanding of that, and what would be a proper approach toward these sort of rhetorics that somehow they're making a chaos within the society?
Well, two things have come together. One is the many millions of Muslims who have perished at the hands of the United States and Israel in West Asia due to warfare, due to economic warfare, sanctions, and the like. You remember the infamous comment of Madeleine Albright about 500,000 Iraqi children having died because of lack of food or medicine. She said, well, sometimes you just have to do this kind of thing. The dehumanization of people very far away from your own country is not hard to achieve. So there is that anti-Muslim bias, which arose from 9/11, and 9/11 was an instance of blowback. If you read the justification for it by Osama bin Laden, who was the architect of it, you will find that it dwells heavily on the suffering of the Palestinians and other predominantly Muslim populations. Of course, many Palestinians are Christian, but that doesn't seem to matter. So that's one thing. Events abroad generate Islamophobia. And then that comes together with the phenomenon I just outlined. That is, people reacting with fear to change. And the change in the country is that instead of being a predominantly Protestant Christian country, as we were for much of our history, we are now a multi-religious society. We have Jews, we have Muslims, we have Buddhists, we have Hindus. I mean, after all, the vice president's wife is a Hindu. And this is very alarming to evangelical Christians, which is why they have turned to a strongman named Donald Trump. And so the two things come together, and you get an upsurge of Islamophobia domestically. And we saw this in the first Trump administration at the instance of Stephen Miller, who is a truly despicable character in the administration, who seems to have Nazi officials as his heroes, Heinrich Himmler and others, from whom he's quoted. He's plagiarized things they said in connection with his eulogy for Charlie Kirk. He is that odd thing, a Jewish Nazi, and he has great influence in the administration. I don't think Donald Trump is a Nazi. He is a vainglorious, malignant narcissist. He has no ideology. Stephen Miller does have an ideology. And he pounced on Trump in the first administration to ban immigration and visits from people in a list of Muslim countries. This is the final expression of these two forces coming together. The events abroad, which of course Americans did not analyze. We were told by the Zionist lobby and its fellow travelers that this attack on New York and Washington had nothing to do with Israel. And in fact, I recall at the time reading the American press and not thinking about it very much. I accepted that. And then I actually read what Osama bin Laden had said and some of the commentary abroad, and realized that, in fact, that was propaganda. What happened had a great deal to do with American policy in the Middle East. And so we've had instances in the United States where homegrown American Muslims, in sympathy for their fellow religionists abroad, have engaged in acts of violence. I think of people in the U.S. Army who have flipped, basically, out of rage at the dehumanization of Muslims. So this is a very evil phenomenon, but I don't think it's that hard to understand.
We had, Israel assassinating one of the most important commanders of Hezbollah. I think he was the head of, the military.
He was the chief of their armed forces.
Yeah, chief of their armed.
Had spent his career building those armed forces, was highly respected in Lebanon and by his fellow members in Hezbollah. Of course, Lebanon is a very fragmented society, and it lends itself to the typical Israeli technique of divide and rule. Israel loves to promote divisions. And in fact, there was a plan by somebody named Yinon years ago in Israel to fragment, make Egypt into 3 or 4 countries, turn Lebanon into 2 or 3 countries, fragment Syria, which they're now trying to do again, take Iran and fragment it along, since in Iran, the Persian element is not, is merely part of the society. Many minorities exist, some Arab, some Kurd, some other nationalities. I think you know that better than I. And Israel tries to divide all these people. So what's going on in Lebanon is an effort to disempower Hezbollah, to use the United States to force the disarmament of Hezbollah, which would mean that Israel face no real opposition in Lebanon because the Lebanese army is incapable of defending Lebanon. And of course, Israel has signed a ceasefire agreement, but it doesn't respect it. I think Hezbollah has basically been respecting that ceasefire, but Israel has not. So you get an aerial attack, which is intended to show people in Lebanon that Israel still has the intelligence capability to target prominent individuals and kill them. This is a foreign policy of assassination. It doesn't work. Israel's practiced it from the outset of its existence. It has killed many thousands of prominent people. Anyone who sticks his head up above ground basically will be mowed down. Mowing the grass is the phrase. So Israel has no policy at all toward its neighbors or Palestinians other than military oppression. There's no political strategy at all. There's no desire to find a basis for peaceful coexistence. There is an assumption that peaceful coexistence is impossible. And that assumption is essentially psychotic. It is a mental disease born of the European Holocaust, which is one of the most horrifying events in human history and has left great trauma among Israelis. And they have been able to assimilate the Mizrahim, the Sephardic Arab Jews, the Persian Jews, the Iraqi Jews, the American Jews, and so forth, into this trauma. So the whole society is based on the belief that everyone in the world wants to kill them because everyone in the world wants to kill Jews, which is, of course, complete nonsense. But it is a firm psychotic conviction of the Israeli leadership, which is why they behave as they do. And it is why they are no longer acceptable in polite company abroad. And they are losing all support in the West as they behave in a barbarous fashion.
Ambassador, before coming up, you mentioned that you watched the interview that the foreign minister of Iran had with the Economist. We know that 2 days ago, an Israeli fighter jet went to invaded the Iraqi airspace, went to the border, close to the border of Iran, refueled by American planes. And on the other hand, we've learned that Donald Trump he gave the green light to Israel to attack Lebanon as well. What is your understanding of the agenda on the part of the Biden administration and how supportive the Trump administration would be in that direction if they decide, for example, to attack Iran again?
Well, it is very clear, as we have discussed before, and as people in the Republican Party who favor a more restrained foreign policy and who really believe in America first, Donald Trump practices an Israel first policy. And he does that because of his donor base, maybe his background in New York. If you live in New York in the past, you never heard any criticism of Israel because you lived in a bubble. The bubble did not allow the perception of actual reality. It perpetuated perceptions that are manufactured. So Israel did no wrong, and anybody who spoke, as I did many years ago, about Israeli atrocities was looked at as though I was insane. What Israeli atrocities? Well, if you actually knew what was happening, there were plenty of them. But if you lived in New York or Washington, where free speech was suppressed on this subject. You didn't know that. So I think Donald Trump may be ignorant. I don't think he's evil-minded, and his ignorance and his subservience to the Israel lobby means that the answer to your question, when Israel attacks Iran again, which they've said they will do, um, I'm sorry to say my country will probably back them.
Yeah. I don't know if the outcome would be different from the first, round of attack, but
Well, that is exactly what Foreign Minister Arakchi said, very politely to the Economist interviewers. He said, we are far better prepared for a war than we were. We have learned something. We have reviewed our mistakes. We have buttressed our supply of missiles. Iran actually, in the 3 rounds of its responses to Israeli attacks, Iran has actually expended the old inefficient missiles, and its missile force now is very advanced and effective. And if Israel does, in fact, carry out its declared intention to resume war with Iran, I think Israel will find that Iran does not limit its targeting to military and intelligence sites as it did in the so-called 12-day war and previously, but actually attacks, as Israel did, attacks civilian targets. And that is, practices warfare as it was reinvented in World War II. World War II democracies invented total war. That is, war on the economy, war on the civilian population, and so on. This is something that Israel has always practiced. Iran has not. And I think out of religious scruples, but also the traditions of the region prior to the establishment of Israel did not include that kind of warfare. So we will, I hope, not see another war between Israel and Iran, but I fear we will. And if we do, as Foreign Minister Arakchi intimated, Iran will take a much larger toll on Israel than it has previously.
Donald Trump and Tom Brock, they did everything to force the government in Lebanon to separate them from Hezbollah. But it seems that as time goes by, the way that they're behaving, they're bombing the southern part of Lebanon, the assassination that has happened, that you mentioned, the top head of Hezbollah has, they have assassinated him. How is that going to influence their policy? Because they wanted to separate the government from Hezbollah. And right now, they put the government in a position that they have no other option but supporting, Hezbollah and going against the policies of Israel, the way that they're attacking Lebanon.
Well, this sort of policy is the product of delusional reasoning. The assumption is that Hezbollah is some sort of terrorist organization, and the propaganda is that it is exploiting the Lebanese people and abusing them. But in fact, it is a mass movement which arose during the 1982 Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, and a defensive force for Lebanese. And from that militia that grew then, we got a quasi-fascist movement called Hezbollah. I say quasi-fascist because it is in effect a state within a state. If you visit Beirut, I remember being very struck the last time I was there. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I had to go to the airport to leave, and who was out on the street cleaning the streets? Hezbollah, not the government. So Hezbollah provides all sorts of services and support for the Lebanese that the government is incapable of supplying. And it represents a majority in Lebanon, as has been shown in elections. It may be a majority that some Christian Lebanese who have made common cause with Israel dislike. It may be a majority that Americans dislike. But It is a reality. And you cannot deal with Lebanon as though that reality did not exist. So the effort to disarm Hezbollah and disband it and turn the Lebanese governance of Lebanon over to a Christian minority, it doesn't work. And in fact, all it does is unify other Lebanese behind Hezbollah when they, for example, Sunni Lebanese who have historically disliked and opposed Hezbollah, now on nationalist grounds have to support it. So it's exactly as you said. The net effect of this policy is not to divide Lebanese as is intended, but to unite them against Israel and against the United States.
How do you evaluate the 28-point plan of the United States, which was negotiated in Geneva? Marco Rubio went to Geneva talking with the Europeans together with Ukrainian delegation. It seems that the whole case, still we don't know who has published the document. People are talking about Keith Kellogg publishing that. But
Well,
after all, what is happening? Do you think that what's going on between the United States and Europeans basically would help the whole process of reaching a settlement in Ukraine?
well, first of all, it's not really a plan. It's a public relations document. Second, it's pretty clear that the Trump administration's focus remains on a ceasefire. The London press today reports that Trump plans to recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea and Donbass. That is an effort to get a ceasefire. It is also, I think, entirely out of sequence. Recognition of territorial differences, changes should be the result of a peace process, not a step toward it. So I don't know. I hope this report is incorrect. It's perfectly obvious that at the end of this war, when it does end, Russia is going to own Crimea and Donbass. That is not going to go back to Ukraine. So let me come finally. The 28 points have been reduced to 19. That's not an improvement. Basically, the Europeans who want the war to continue have failed to produce a peace proposal. What they have done is try to deform the peace proposal that Donald Trump and his crony envoy, Stephen Witkoff, with the help of Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's associate, have informally come up with. And the Russians keep saying they have not received any kind of draft proposal. This isn't a draft proposal. And you cannot the great mistake that the Trump administration has made in every context, Gaza, for example, now Ukraine, is to imagine that you can impose a peace on the warring parties. No, you can't. You may have ideas about what they should do, but if they don't agree, they won't do them. So there is no ceasefire in Gaza, despite all the claims that there is. Hamas has not agreed to disarm and will not. Israel has not withdrawn and will not agree to it, and so forth. So this is a stillborn agreement, not a live one. Ukraine is the same. You cannot compose a peace agreement without directly engaging all the parties. And there are many components to this. There is Russia and Ukraine, which have to reach an agreement on their border. There is Russia and NATO, plus including the United States and Ukraine, which must agree on the neutralization of Ukraine for this war to end, because Russia will not end it unless and until Ukraine returns to the neutrality with which it began its independent existence. And there must be protections for minorities in Ukraine. The Russians are concerned about Russians, Hungarians are concerned about Hungarians, but Ukraine must return to the European standard set out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Security in Europe, the OSCE, which requires European countries to treat minorities with respect for their cultural and linguistic autonomy. Ukraine has to do that. That is an issue that concerns the European Union, which Ukraine aspires to join. The idea that you can't limit the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, for example, which people like Kaja Kallas, the European foreign policy spokesperson, say, or Ursula von der Leyen, this is complete nonsense. Arms control is normal in international relations, and it involves, as in the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, now obsolete, did after the end of the Cold War, it involves limitations on weaponry and troop strengths and so forth, deployments. Ukraine's security depends on its reaching an accommodation with Russia. If it does not reach an accommodation with Russia, it will continue to lose manpower, people at a horrifying level, and it will lose territory. And so, neither the United States nor Europe is in a position to dictate a peace. You cannot dictate something that ignores realities on the battlefield. You cannot regain at the negotiating table what you have lost on the battlefield. And so whatever happens, I think Vladimir Putin is correct. The proposal that has been made by Trump is an advance because it does begin to recognize some of the battlefield realities. And it is therefore, as he put it, as President Putin put it, a possible basis for negotiation. But it is not a peace, and it is not a draft treaty, nothing close to it. So unfortunately, given realities on the Ukrainian and European side, Europe is now solely responsible for the war in Ukraine. The United States is basically withdrawing from that fight. Europe does not have the ability, the capability, the weapons production levels, or the money to keep Ukraine from folding. And so that is going to happen at some point. And I guess I'd conclude by saying that the tragedy here is that it's perfectly obvious that the more time passes, the fewer the options Ukraine has, and the narrower the possibilities for a peace. If Ukraine had been allowed to agree to what it did agree to in March 2022 at Istanbul, it would be in a far better condition than it is now. And if it doesn't agree to a peace now, it will be in a far worse condition in future than it is now. So time is not on Ukraine's side. And I think the Trump administration has recognized that to its credit.
Here is what Ambassador, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said about that Moscow stands for a normal and calm process of negotiations with the United States on Ukraine and does not want to participate in any dirty games, because they see the whole process of publishing the points and the way that they're pushing for 1928 and then 22. Donald Trump said they call it a dirty game. They don't see any seriousness in the process of talking, negotiating with the United States. And how do you see the role of Steve Witkoff? Yesterday, Putin said that the officials who are negotiating with the United States is not really he didn't mention that he's not cruelly motivated, but he says the officials, you know, those people mainly responsible for the negotiations are Ushakov and the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov. And just getting to the case of negotiations with Iran, we've learned with the case of the negotiations between Iran and the United States, the foreign minister of Iran said that he in an interview that he did in Persian, he said that Iran and the United States, they have reached three times, they have reached an agreement with Steve Witkoff, and every time Steve Witkoff talked with Washington, and they said no, that's not possible, and they changed the, who's responsible, who's doing this? Do you think it's Marco Rubio and the people around him? Is Donald Trump? Is who's responsible for that, and who's making decisions in Washington?
Well, ultimately, the responsibility and the guidance all come from Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is manipulable by domestic lobbies. In the case of anything involving Israel, the Israel or Zionist lobby. In the case of anything involving Russia, the neocons, who are still very much alive and well, and populate the United States Senate, among other places. I think I need to make a couple of points here, because the unrealism on the part of the Europeans has to be challenged. So von der Leyen says, well, you can't, and Kaja Kallas say that the acquisition of territory by force is unacceptable. Well, do they apply that to Israel? No, they don't. Do they apply that to Serbia? No, Kosovo was separated from Serbia. What sort of relationship does Russia want with Ukraine? It wants the same kind of relationship the United States has with Canada and Mexico. In the case of Mexico, the United States took 1/3 of Mexico's territory in a war, the Mexican War of 1848. The Mexicans, like the Finns in the period of the Cold War, are very careful in their relations with the United States not to cross a line that leads to armed conflict. Russia would like to have a relationship with Ukraine that is as friendly as Americans had before Donald Trump with Canada. We are very similar people, have different histories and political systems, different societies, but we speak the same language, more or less, and we understand each other quite well, or we did. Russia has limited objectives in Ukraine, and the European thesis that it wants to take all of Ukraine, there's no evidence at all for that. There's no evidence that Russia has any desire for Lebensraum in Europe. It's got plenty of territory. It does not want rebellious citizens. It has enough minorities. It is a very complex society. It does not want more trouble, but it is not prepared to accept a hostile armed presence in Ukraine. And it has made that clear now for more than 2 decades, 3 decades almost. So there should be no surprises here, and there should be no expectation that the war can end without addressing the Russian security concerns, which so far have not been adequately addressed, although the 19-point proposal does begin to acknowledge that they exist. You're muted, Nima.
We know that Russia is in the process of moving toward the east, but is there any sort of concern in Europeans that, the basics of the economy shows that the relationship between Russia and Europe is crucial for the future of Europe? And they don't seem to understand that. They don't seem to, care about that. how far they would go against Russia, how far they would go against their future.
Europe, over the last, most of the last 5 centuries, has been the powerhouse on the planet. Science and technology, innovation, engineering, military strength, economic strength, raising living standards, progressive advancement in comparison with other societies. But Europe is now the sick man of Eurasia. It is losing its edge in every area. It is not innovating to the extent that the Chinese now are. It is dependent, as you said, on imported resources. It has cut itself off from Russia, which is a major source of such resources, not the only one. It has not handled its relations with Africa, which is an alternative source of many resources, properly. It does not have control of its borders. And while Europe outside Russia spends 4 or 5 times as much on military matters as the Russians do, they do it in an inefficient manner. And Europeans seem to be determined to remain less than the sum of their parts. So Europe is declining, and Europe is doing nothing effective to reverse that decline. Building up armed forces, doubling the budget as Germany proposes to do, increasing the budget as Macron, but not the voters of France, wanted to do, is not an answer to this question. That is not going to revitalize European society. And part of the problem is, I guess, a sort of hubris, a kind of excessive pride and complacency born of past supremacy. Europe is not supreme in the world anymore. The West is not supreme. This is a much more complicated planet than it was. And as you know, I think it is becoming multinodal. I don't like the word multipolar, but multinodal, because a node is a point at which many connections can be made of varying thickness and intensity, and in which rotation can occur. It's 3-dimensional. It's not 2-dimensional like a pole. So this is a world that Europe needs to define how it is going to deal with a world in which the West is no longer supreme, in which the United States is no longer its reliable backer or hegemon, and in which other societies, China, India, and arguably Islamic culture, are on the rise. I mean, I say Islamic culture perhaps because I find it very strange and disturbing that whereas China, which was humiliated and reduced, has recovered its civilizational status and leadership position, and India is clearly in the process of doing that, it's very uncertain whether that is happening in the Arab world or Iran, or the Islamic world more generally. I mean, we see powerhouses emerging in the Islamic world like Indonesia. Pakistan is problematic in my view, many problems. Iran, if it were not subject to international oppression, might well catalyze the sort of renaissance in the Islamic world that has not happened. So there's a big question mark over the Islamic 2 billion Muslims in the world, and whether they will find a way to return to the greatness that Islam represented when Europe was in the Dark Ages, and Islamic societies, particularly the Abbasids and others, or Muslim Spain, Andalus, were were where any alien visiting the planet during that period would have gone to Baghdad or Damascus or Cordoba to meet with the advanced people in the world, or he might have gone to Kaifeng or someplace in China, but he would never have gone to Europe. Europe is returning to the obscurity in which it then existed. And Europeans really need to rethink their place in the world. I have not spoken of South America, which I think is also potentially very dynamic. It is part of Western culture, but a unique branch of it.
The whole issue of Ukraine, Ambassador, is neutrality of Ukraine. And if we think of neutrality, we remember, Austria or Sweden and Finland before joining NATO. You don't see in these countries huge army. You don't see in these countries, the presence of NATO. They're neutral. That's why we call them neutral. And how the whole point of negotiations and what's going on between the West and Russia about Ukraine is all about neutrality. I don't know if they get it or they want to get it.
They don't want to get it. They prefer to fight to the last Ukrainian against the Russians. The obvious answer to European security more broadly is the establishment of Ukraine as a buffer state between Russia and the rest of Europe. That benefits the rest of Europe and Russia, and it provides a basis, as the case of Austria or Sweden or Finland you mentioned suggest, for Ukraine to, what is left of Ukraine after this war is over, this unnecessary war is over, what is left of Ukraine has an opportunity to become prosperous and democratic. It is neither. It is the poorest country in Europe. It is the most corrupt. It is a dictatorship. It is not a democracy. It is not governed by a constitutional president. It could not at all qualify to get into the European Union under present conditions. But a neutral, independent Ukraine that serves as both a buffer and a bridge between Russian Europe and the rest of Europe is a country that can prosper and develop democratically, as this Ukraine cannot. You cannot have a constant war in Europe as the basis of a peace. That is the mistake the Europeans are making. They are assuming there is no alternative to deterrence of a presumed Russian ambition to take Europe. But there is no such ambition. Deterrence does not provide a basis for peace. It is inherently provocative. It leads to the creation of the very threat from Russia that they're trying to avoid. Similarly, Russian actions in Ukraine have alarmed Europeans. They've brought Sweden and Finland into NATO. This is a very negative result from the Russian point of view. And it needs to be, Europe needs to find a basis for peaceful coexistence between East and West, and it has not done it. And the Europeans don't have any serious thoughts about how to do it, which is why they're not at the negotiating table.
I think, Ambassador, we know that how Russia reacts to the seizure of their asset in Europe. But after all, when it comes, if the main goal is the reconstruction of Ukraine, in my opinion, Russia would be more than happy to participate in that, to have a government friendly to both Russia and the Europeans.
Of course. Of course. Prior to the 2014 coup in Kyiv, which the United States and Britain had something to do with carrying out, in fact, a lot to do with carrying it out, Ukraine and Russia had an integrated economy. They were very compatible. Um, if there were peace in Ukraine, if Ukraine were neutral and not a threat to Russia, I agree with you. The Russians would be more than happy to invest in Ukraine to try to redevelop it, reconstruct it in cooperation with your other Europeans and maybe the United States. Uh, I think, the idea that somehow the Russian reserves that had been sequestered by Belgium and others should be applied to this is a subject that could be addressed after there is a peace. It cannot be a condition for peace. And I think the Russians, if they were smart, and I think they are very smart, I know slightly, I know Ryabkov, I have observed Lavrov close up. These are very capable people. And I think they would have the good grace and wit to be magnanimous, to realize that it's in their interest to have a prosperous Ukraine, a market for their goods, a source of investment for their industries in partnership with your other Europeans. I think if you had a peace, many things would be possible. But to argue that somehow or other, as the Europeans do, basically this war has to end with Putin in The Hague under trial, the Russian reserves confiscated by Europeans for the benefit of Ukraine, all of the territory that Ukraine has lost to Russia returned to Ukraine, and no change in the Ukrainian constitutional system to recognize the rights of linguistic and cultural minorities. This is absurd. This is a pipe dream. It's worse than that. It's a kind of psychosis. It doesn't a failure to perceive reality that is tragic for everybody involved, including, of course, mostly Ukrainians and Russians.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Well,
and happy Thanksgiving. It's the day after, but
no, we had a great Thanksgiving. Thank you, and I apologize for the noise that someone may have heard. There are people blowing leaves outside my house in Rhode Island, where I am, and it was a pleasure to talk to you, Nima. You have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too, Ambassador.